Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this panel for Decolonizing Library Collections and Spaces. I actually want to share my screen really quick before I get going, sorry. Okay, so hi again, everybody. My name is Amanda Runyon, and I'm the director of the Biddle Law Library at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey Law School. I will be moderating this exciting panel. Before we begin, I would like to thank our panelists who made the time to share insights and lessons learned from their work to decolonize their libraries. I'm looking forward to learning from you all this evening. I would also like to express my gratitude to my Penn Law colleagues in the Toll Public Interest Center and the Biddle Law Library for making this panel possible. I'm very excited that TPIC partnered with Biddle to offer this panel, as this partnership recognizes the contributions that libraries can make to public interest work and in working toward racial justice by examining and correcting some of the instances of racial injustice within legal information and research. I look forward to future collaborations. In the next few minutes, I would like to offer some brief thoughts about what is meant by decolonizing libraries so that we have a shared framework for tonight's discussion. Afterward, I will introduce our panelists. So what does it mean to decolonize libraries? Of course, this is a broad subject, but to paraphrase Dr. Nicole Cook, decolonizing libraries is the process of decentering whiteness and being more inclusive to voices of color and voices representing diverse perspectives. Dr. Cook issues a call to action. As librarians, we must have honest, direct conversations about anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. We must acknowledge our role as gatekeepers of information and the impact of our centering of white Western norms. As a profession, I think we have a unique opportunity to challenge entrenched social structures. One way we can do this is by examining how we categorize information. We know that words have tremendous power. So one meaningful step that we can take toward decolonization is to change the language that we use to classify and talk about information. As societies evolve, so too does the language of representation. However, libraries and librarians are too often too far behind these changes. The classification and indexing systems used by libraries, both those that are adopted from the Library of Congress and those developed in-house, are inherently biased and centered on the perspectives of white people, Christians, heterosexuals, and males. At best, the language used by these systems obscures and silences the voices of marginalized people. However, it is not uncommon for the language and structures in these classification systems to actively contribute to the ongoing marginalization and dehumanization of underrepresented communities. We must remember that classification and indexing systems have the power to define information and the power to control access to that information. A really wonderful article on this subject was written by Grace Lowe, a reference librarian at Stanford Law School's Crown Law Library, entitled Aliens versus Catalogers: Bias in the Library of Congress Subject Headings. In the article, she discusses how the centering of the Library of Congress's classification and indexing systems on the white, Christian, heterosexual, male perspective privileges this viewpoint, and importantly, replicates the same thought process in the users of these systems. She further discusses how these systems influence the outcome of research by structuring how people think, write, and talk about subjects. These classification systems create a self-perpetuating cycle. We use bias systems to classify information. Researchers must then learn and adopt these systems to access and navigate information, which shapes how they think about these topics, what information they access, and potentially the arguments that they make and the conclusions that they draw. One example of the impact of these systematic biases was the Library of Congress's grouping of primary laws of indigenous nations in America together with US law. This grouped classification failed to reflect tribal sovereignty, and it eliminated the distinction between American federal law about Indians and primary Indian law. It also treated the thousands of indigenous populations as one singular entity. This was not corrected until 2013. There have also been several notable recent movements to add or change Library of Congress subject headings, all of which have failed. These have included proposals to add subject headings for male privilege and white privilege, and the more widely known effort by Dartmouth College students to change the derogatory and dehumanizing subject heading illegal alien. When the Library of Congress eventually agreed to make this change, Congress prevented it. Now, I don't want the non-librarians in the audience to believe that biased information classification systems are limited to libraries. A tool that many of you are familiar with, the West key number system, has many of the same types of biases. Its broad applicability in the structure and classification of case law is also highly problematic, particularly as the use of artificial intelligence expands in legal research and practice. It's important for librarians and researchers to continuously advocate for changes to classification systems. We must also recognize and reflect on our own internal biases and work to deconstruct the language in the systems we use that perpetuate the continued marginalization of others. We cannot remain neutral about these systems, as neutrality is an implicit endorsement of the system. Thankfully, we're joined tonight by 4 people who've been doing important and exciting work in materials classification and other important areas of decolonizing library stacks. I'm excited to now introduce each of them to you and to hear more about their work, the lessons they have learned along the way, and what they hope to do next. First, we are joined by Narine Bornutian. Narine is the head of continuing resources and collection maintenance at the Columbia University Law Library. She manages print serial subscriptions and the physical organization of the on-site library collection, which consists of almost 500,000 volumes across 3 floors. She will discuss a recent project at the Columbia University Law Library to decolonize an older in-house classification system for foreign law. We are also joined this evening by Donna Nixon, who is electronic resources librarian and clinical professor of law at the University of North Carolina School of Law. She licenses and manages the law library's electronic media and teaches legal research and introduction to law of the US. Donna will discuss her work curating the digital collection Law School First, the African Americans who integrated UNC Chapel Hill, and her subsequent essay in the North Carolina Law Review documenting the long, bitter, but ultimately successful legal fight by the 5 men who integrated UNC Chapel Hill. Our next panelist is Rebecca Stewart, the Director for Academic Engagement at the Penn Libraries. Rebecca works with collections and researchers in classical studies and Russian and East European history and literature. Her research interests span the areas of music, ethnic American autobiography, library preservation, open access, and contemporary American literature. Rebecca will discuss her involvement in issues of diversity and library collections at Penn and Grinnell College, where she previously worked. And finally, we are also joined by Jessica Ugstead, who is a library collection management specialist at the University of Arizona's Daniel F. Cracchiolo Law Library. In this role, Jessica has worked to improve access to existing library, archive, and special collection resources, develop new collections focused on resources by, for, and about underrepresented and marginalized people, communities, topics, and histories, and to apply the archivist as activist approach to collection management and stewardship to move the profession, workplace, and society in general towards social justice, anti-racism, and decolonization. Jessica will discuss collaborative efforts with her colleagues at the Cracchiolo Law Library to center the voices and perspectives of marginalized communities through collection and resource development. Thank you all for joining us, and I will ask Narine to speak about her work.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Okay. Well, hello everyone. My name is Narine Bernutian, and as part of the Decolonizing the Stacks panel, I'm going to talk about the Columbia Law Library's efforts in revising homegrown foreign law classifications. So at the Columbia Law Library, we use the Library of Congress system for cataloging most of our collection. However, we also use something called the Schiller Classification system. It's locally developed or homegrown, which means it was designed to be used by the Columbia Law Library and not a system that's commonly used on a state or national level, like the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress. It's used for classifying foreign, comparative, pre-literate, ancient, medieval, and religious law materials. The Schiller system was created between 1933 and 1938 by A. Arthur Schiller, a professor of law at Columbia who specialized in Roman law, African law, and military law, among other topics. For the purposes of this presentation, we're just going to be focusing on the foreign law portions of the collection and the classification system. So it might be easier to understand the Schiller system by first looking at how the foreign law call numbers work. Here are a couple of examples of Schiller call numbers. The abbreviation of the jurisdiction name and its corresponding legal system on the top line, and the classification number, which describes the specific topic or subject area of the book on the second line. And there can be additional lines, including a code to help differentiate between different works on the same topic and the publication year. but all the Schiller call numbers have these first two lines, the jurisdiction abbreviation and the classification number. And that's the point of the system, to make it easier to research foreign, comparative, religious, and historical law materials. The researcher can find items on the same subject under the same classification number in different legal systems. So to look at our examples, anything with a 970 is about financial law, and the first line distinguishes which jurisdiction's legal system the book covers. And there have been regular adjustments made to the Schiller system since it was first created. There was one large revision in 1964 and another in the late 90s. And in regards to the foreign law and jurisdiction abbreviations, frequent updates have been made as needed throughout the system's history when countries are renamed or new ones created. So what was the problem with that? Well, up until 2019, the Schiller system had additional prefixes for the majority of countries within the African continent and within Central and South America. The prefix AF was added before the abbreviations of African governing bodies, as you can see with the start of the Kenyan and Tanzanian law call numbers. Notably, this did not include Egyptian or South African law materials, which were classified without the AF prefix. The prefix SP for Spanish American was added before the abbreviations of Central and South American countries, as you can see with the example of Cuban and Colombian call numbers. And these were also added to regions in Central and South America where Spanish was not the predominant or official language, such as Haiti, Brazil, and Belize. And it's worth noting that the term Spanish American was used by the Library of Congress for works about Central and South America until 1964, when it was replaced by the term Latin American. The 1964 revision of the Schiller system recommended that any new library adopting the classification system should replace SP with LA for accuracy, although it did not advocate that Columbia law make this alteration its own collection at that time. So the classification system was unevenly applied and inaccurate, to say the least. And although it certainly wasn't the intention of Schiller, these prefixes in general created the impression that these regions were easily lumped together into a single category, instead of being treated as separate and distinct entities like the other countries in our collection. We had no other prefixes based on either continent name or language. Our Italian materials weren't tagged with Euro prefixes, for example. So our African and Central and South American materials were treated uniquely, but not necessarily in a positive way. Classification can be seen as just another method of description, of categorization. And the Schiller system's categorizations conveyed this idea that these materials had been deemed less complex or less sophisticated than jurisdictions that were granted their own separate abbreviations. And this was also reflected in the physical organization of the floor and the corresponding floor map. You can see that the SP materials are interfiled alphabetically by the SP prefix, but that the AF materials were placed at the very end of the foreign law collection, out of alphabetical call number order. And this was another way that these collections stood outside of the logic of our classification and organizational systems. I would often have to direct patrons to these oddly placed locations when they were looking for books on these topics. And I would usually have the same conversation whenever I trained a new staff member or student worker and made a point to highlight these two sections as peculiar. And every time I explained this, I received a mix of similar reactions: horrified amusement at the inaccuracies and disbelief that these prefixes were still in use. And a common response I would receive was, well, why hasn't this been changed yet? And it was the same question that I first asked when I started working at the library, and I gave the same answer that I had received, that a project to reclassify, relabel, and then relocate the collections to keep call number order would be immensely time and labor intensive. And given that our foreign collection at the time had many older and fragile volumes, such a project could risk physical damage to many of our materials. However, the opportunity to revise the Schiller classifications and collection organization came about in late 2017, when we began preparing for an upcoming library renovation, which would turn one of our floors of stacks into study space. So the library embarked on a project to move 200,000 older volumes to an offsite storage facility, and then rearrange the on-site collection across the 3 remaining stack floors. So all of this meant that we were prepared for enormous collection reorganization across the entire library. We had extra student workers approved for the project, and full-time library staff dedicated a portion of their regular work hours to assist. The remaining foreign materials were in excellent condition and could be easily moved without risk of damage. The library administration felt that as long as these resources were available, reclassifying the SP and AF collections could be integrated within the renovation preparations. And I'd like to take the moment to acknowledge our FCIL librarian, who was instrumental in spearheading this effort, as well as our director and head of technical services, both of whom approved the reclassification and supported all the extra time and effort that went into it. So after the older volumes were removed from the foreign collection, we reclassified the SP and AF materials in the spring of 2019. Our catalogers were able to batch update all the catalog records to strip out the prefixes before each jurisdiction name. So to go back to one of our previous examples, Tanzania went from AFTAN to TAN. In a few cases, the catalogers had to come up with a new abbreviation after taking the prefix out to avoid overlap with other jurisdiction names in the system. So they had to add these new abbreviations into the catalog records in a whole separate process. So altogether, the cataloging staff updated almost 29,000 catalog records, including titles that are held in our offsite storage facilities. It was a tremendous update that required a lot of time and effort from our cataloging department. So due to an upcoming database migration, the classifications were changed in the catalog before the books could be relabeled or relocated. So we had to create directional and explanatory signage for the patrons so they could locate the correct book, which was tricky when the physical label didn't match the catalog call number or the call numbers on the floor maps. So staff had to put in extra effort to make sure that the patrons could find all the necessary items. We assigned the relabeling of the physical volumes to a small army of student workers and to our support staff, who worked to correct all the remaining volumes on site. Altogether, over 18,000 volumes were physically relabeled. The final and still ongoing step in reorganizing the Schiller collection into alphabetical call number order, based on the topical or jurisdiction name. So the top of our stacks would start with the call number A for ancient law, and then run alphabetically, A through Z, through the Schiller collections until Zimbabwe. Because of the complexity involved, we're doing the project in-house with rotating teams of library staff and not contracting it out to an outside moving company like we did with the other portions of our renovation shifts. And you can see the highlighted call numbers here, which are the former SP and AF, and that they need to be interfiled with many others. So there's a lot of stopping, jumping around between different sections of the floor, double checking that we haven't skipped an entire jurisdiction. Almost 2/3 of our total staff, it's about 25 people, volunteered an hour outside of their regular duties every week to assist with this reorganization. And I'm very grateful to have such dedicated colleagues who frequently express their excitement about finally having our foreign law in a logical and easy to browse arrangement. Our shutdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely delayed the project. We've currently shifted through Kenyan law materials into proper order, And we've slowly resumed the project using rotating single staff members instead of teams for proper social distancing. So it's still a slow process. We've shifted about 6,850 linear feet of materials, and we still have about 3,400 linear feet to go. So to put it another way, we've moved over a mile of books, but we still have more than half a mile to go. And I'd like to acknowledge once again the work of my colleagues in completing this tremendous project, especially the many student workers and support staff members who dedicated hours of labor to this. And in particular, our manager of collection maintenance and offsite storage, who was instrumental in coordinating the entire project and the many people that were involved. And finally, I'd like to say that if anyone is interested in learning more about efforts to eliminate inequalities and biases in library cataloging, you should check out the hashtag CritCat on Twitter. It's full of librarians in all types of libraries who are doing amazing work to improve local systems like the Schiller Classification system, or national cataloging standards like the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress. And thank you all very much for your time. And thanks again to the panel organizers for having me here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, now, Renee. We do have a question for you, which is, why didn't you use LC call numbers, Library of Congress call numbers, when updating the collection?
Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, one advantage of the Schiller system is the fact that it makes it easier to browse between different jurisdictions of foreign law, different types of religious law. So we wanted to maintain that, and that's something that we felt the Library of Congress system didn't offer.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Donna Nixon to speak about her work curating a digital collection at the University of North Carolina. Thanks, Donna.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My project to help decolonize our law library was to create an online collection to tell the story of the legal fight to integrate the campus's student body. The University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill rightly prides itself in being the first public university in the United States. However, it is now reckoning with the role that racial oppression played in that glorified history, including the fact that the campus stands on Native American traditional lands, that it was largely built, maintained, and funded by enslaved laborers, and that its leaders maintained a staunch commitment to keeping African Americans out of its student body well into the 1950s. Here, I'll discuss our library's work building a digital collection documenting that fight to integrate UNC Chapel Hill's student body. And I'll talk about the law review essay that I wrote to further illuminate that history. Black people had existed on the campus as invisible and often oppressed labor since the university's inception. Yet for 155 years, no African American could get an education there. In 2015, we celebrated the 65th anniversary of the first Black students attending UNC Chapel Hill. At the same time, the campus and the law school, as was the nation, struggled with issues of racial inequity, including deaths of unarmed African Americans, few people of color in leadership roles, Confederate monuments, and more. The Confederate statue, referred to as Silent Sam, held a central place on the campus's idyllic main quad. Protest of the statue and of other issues had been flaring up for decades, with students often leading campaigns for change. The halls of our law school overflow with depictions and celebrations of many, many white men who were instrumental in its history. In 2015, the UNC Law Library began building digital collections that focused on the law school's history. The first collection celebrated the life of William Aycock, a law faculty member who served as chancellor of the UNC Chapel Hill campus from 1957 to 1964. But in 2016, the library leadership asked me to help build a collection commemorating the young men who had integrated the law school. This is an iconic picture of the first 4 African Americans to register for classes at UNC in June of 1951. Floyd McKissick, J. Kenneth Lee, Harvey Beach, and James Lassiter. Another student, James Walker, registered for classes later, but started classes along with these 4 men. For Black History Month and special celebrations, we trotted out this picture, but there wasn't really any depth to the simple story that we told. We were fortunate though. Our campus libraries have methodically captured, archived, and indexed the history of the campus, the statewide university system, and the state of North Carolina itself. Those archives and collections helped us build a substantial digital gallery. We gathered information and materials from the university and law school archives, including archives of chancellors, deans, and presidents of UNC, archives of the Daily Tar Heel, the campus newspaper, and audio and transcripts of oral histories taken from important figures at UNC, including online access to listen to 3 of the men tell their stories about how they integrated the university. We also have access to North Carolina and national newspaper archives. And the campus libraries have purchased access to important databases like Ancestry.com, which aggregates birth, death, marriage, military, and other public records. And the libraries have also purchased archives of major organizations like the NAACP. The more I delved into the history, the more I tapped into the humanity of the men, their individual personalities, their stubborn determination. They risked their lives. They exposed themselves to horrible abuse, threats, and ostracism to be the first Black students. They were not saints. They were fighters who endured real emotional and other harm from ongoing abuse and looming threats. Many of us have simple, happily ever after ideas about civil rights wins. We don't see the daily threats and abuse, the tense life or death moments that some firsts go through after getting past the initial dramatic spasms of white supremacist violence. We don't think of how isolated, dehumanized, and threatened they continue to be daily in what was still a simmering sea of hate. From day one to graduation day, those young men were frequently harassed, threatened, and ostracized. This is a 1949 letter from the president of the UNC system instructing the Chapel Hill chancellor to deny law school admission to Blacks. That year, the university had slapped together a shoddy Negro law program at neighboring North Carolina Central University to avoid having to admit Blacks to UNC Chapel Hill. Here are copies of the complaint filed in the case and a copy of the brief the men's attorneys filed with the United States Supreme Court. We were able to assemble in our digital collection most of the documents filed in that case. And in the library archives were some documents from the time those men spent at UNC. When the men attended UNC Chapel Hill, the university refused to charge them student activity fees so that the university could deny them student recreation privileges and deny them seating at athletic events. This is a telegram that J. Kenneth Lee sent to the governor of North Carolina on behalf of all of the men, demanding that the university allow them to sit with other students at football games, not in the segregated Negro section they were assigned to. They enlisted the NAACP to publicize that issue and to threaten further litigation. Here is the UNC Chancellor's letter giving in, but recommending that the men not use the tickets, hinting that other attendees might attack them. The young men used the tickets. Here from the library archives are the very tickets and passbook that were given to James Walker. The story I wanted to expose was too big for the digital site. My management team kept trying to rein in my efforts at an expansive narrative. Finally, in exasperation, I'm sure, my director suggested I write a law review article, and she connected me with the law review editor. So I wrote the article that connects this story to the wider civil rights story and to the famous decision that outlawed segregation in public accommodations, Brown versus Board of Education. Local historians, news outlets, and educators have utilized the collection and the article to speak about this history, and some have given us leads to resources to further enhance the collection. We've seen in recent months and weeks how fragile are both our democracy and our small gains toward racial equity. False narratives have permeated our history, as have narratives that tell very lopsided and incomplete stories. Our collection brings out of the shadows the story of 5 great men who changed history. My hope is that it will both educate and inspire people to keep fighting for the democratic ideals that we have never quite realized. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
Great. We do have a question that says, thank you for this great presentation. The first 5 African-American students were men. When was the first African-American woman enrolled?
That was, I believe, in 1975, but I'll have to check on that.
Thank you. Great work. Very interesting. Thank you so much. Next up is Rebecca, who will speak with us about her involvement in issues of diversity in library collections.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me here. As Amanda said, I'm Rebecca Stewart. I've been at the University of Pennsylvania for about close to 10 years, and I have been working with collections for most of my 30-year-plus career. Today, I'll be talking about library collections as being truly representative of our society and the world. And I'll also conclude with a brief case history focused on classical studies. Okay, that's not gonna forward. All right. All right. I want to make a note, first of all, on how we're using the term decolonization in light of the article referenced on this slide by Tuck and Yang. The implications of this article are difficult to come to terms with, but in short, the authors state that decolonization shouldn't be used as a metaphor for decentering whiteness or teaching or promoting social justice, although they do agree that those are important endeavors. But in this particular case with this article, they say that the meaning is simple and straightforward, and simply means to stop occupying the land and return it to the original owners. So going forward, I'm going to begin. To begin, I want to imagine that the library is a welcoming place where anyone walking through the doors has a sense of belonging, even ownership. I have a series of questions on my slide. And I think there are many who walk into our libraries who don't sense an affirmative answer to these questions. But academic libraries can be intimidating. At the Penn Libraries, we've had a series called Diversities, where we invite different campus groups to come talk with us. And we began the series by inviting the Cultural Center directors and students to come talk with us about their work and initiatives. Without exceptions, students told us that the library is intimidating. I don't think that most librarians intend for libraries to be intimidating, but there are plenty of ways that the library I work in, Van Pelt Dietrich Library, may reinforce that feeling of being an imposter. And I don't think it's particular to Van Pelt Library. I think this is shared, probably especially across academic libraries. Imagine making it through the doors of the intimidating library. The first thing you might wonder is, where are the books? I did the first time I was in Van Pelt. They are well hidden and the signage doesn't jump out at you. We have barriers of jargon, including stacks, monograph, periodicals, Franklin, and call number arrangements, none of which are transparent or self-evident. What if I don't know what I should already know? What if I ask a question and I appear unprepared? And where are those books? Of course, there are no dumb questions officially, and I think in practice, there are no dumb questions for librarians, but how do I know that? To the question, is my story being told here? Some library users might say, we are learning about history, culture, literature without hyphens or qualifying terms. We are learning about what it means to be human. That doesn't seem exclusive. But what is or has been the definition of human over the past century or two of scholarship? What was the picture of a human being in the mind of the scholars whose books line our shelves? It has become quite clear, clearer than ever, what the likely historical assumption or picture of humans or humanity has been. In the mid-70s, I was looking for evidence of women writers in the classes I took. We read Jane Austen and Emily Dickinson, maybe Sylvia Plath, but these writers were clearly exceptions. In the same vein, if I wanted to read African-American writers, I needed to take the one Afro-American literature course that was offered. Black writers were not in the survey courses. I read Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison after I graduated with my English major. So some, perhaps many of our students will enter the library knowing that they will find something about who they are, where they came from, how they fit into society, without ever thinking to ask the question, is my story told here? Or has someone like me written any of these books? It was always just the case. For many others, the answers to these questions are a little harder to uncover. I don't think that this is just a young person's ego-focused question. They're legitimate questions. At Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa, I had the luxury of being a one-person collection development department. I had a lot of latitude to shape the collection in conversation with faculty and colleagues at the library. I wanted the books on the shelf to reflect the demographics of the United States and our international students. I wanted our students to find themselves in our stacks. Our collections were intended to be research-oriented. Grinnell College students are academically ambitious, and our stacks were visible. Anywhere you were in the library, you were among the books. The 90s were a time of multiculturalism and also a time of repudiating multiculturalism. Some unintentionally ironically decried multiculturalism as a destruction of a shared reference point for American culture. I would argue that that reference point was always exclusive in the extreme. What canon can exclude, for example, Toni Morrison, Sandra Cisneros, Zadie Smith, John Edgar Wideman, Richard Rodriguez, or Dorothy West? Can such an exclusive canon be considered a legitimate shared reference point? While I was doing my collections work to create a diverse and representative collection, we also had two specific collections: the Black Library, dated from the turbulent 60s, and the Latino collection, which was created during the first years of the 21st century, both at the request or demand of students. In short, the collections were identified by location, but also by a colored tape that went across the spine, red for the Black Library and orange for the Latino collection. As books moved from the smaller collection into the larger collection, they remained visible through this color designation. The books were from all subject areas, and so throughout the shelves of our very visible stacks, you could see red and orange tapes making the presence of these books that represented Black and Latino authors, histories, and cultures extremely visible. Students could see the meaningful impact they had on the library. It was their library, they belonged there. At Penn, we have a number of ways in which we highlight collections. Some are on the list on the slide. And I'm going to mention the Diversity in the Stacks initiative. The purpose of the Diversity in the Stacks initiative, which began in September 2019, is to bring to light collections that represent and reflect the university's diverse population and to explore those works in a series of blog posts. They're written by different subject librarians from different collecting areas. The posts highlight existing collections, but I think they help us all think about our collections in terms of diversity. It helps us to bring a new intentionality to our collecting and to how we catalog our materials and increase their discoverability. We are prompted to ask questions about historical omissions, changing definitions and priorities within our fields, whether we are truly reflecting the world as it is and indeed as it has been. So to conclude, I'm going to do this little case study about the field of classical studies. It is accepted by most contemporary scholars in the field that classical studies has a history of Eurocentrism. We can say that from about the mid-18th century, there's been a steady whitewashing of the interpretation of the historical record to show a straight and uninterrupted line from ancient Greece to white European culture or Western civilization, a phrase that's currently contested. You don't have to be a classical studies scholar to know that white supremacists are co-opting that Eurocentric interpretation to support their own theories of superiority. And my colleague, Deborah Stewart, our Penn Museum librarian, shared just on Tuesday with me an article that appeared in the New York Times. I have it linked there, but that covers exactly what I'm talking about right now. But at the same time, writers over generations and from many cultures and regions, from the American South to India, to the Caribbean, to the African continent, to combat veterans, have looked to Homer's epics and the ancient Greek tragedies for inspiration as they seek to share and interpret their stories, experiences, personal and national tragedies. These ancient texts continue to provide insight to readers, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, national origin, with or without Ivy League educations. At the same time, Alan Bloom published The Closing of the American Mind, British sinologist Martin Bernal published Black Athena, the first of a 3-volume opus written over 30 years. Bernal presented linguistic material and textual evidence to argue that ancient Greece had its roots in Afro-Asiatic culture. While this may not seem a stretch for a seafaring people in the middle of trade routes that crisscross the Mediterranean, including Egypt and other parts of Africa, his writings were hotly debated and emotionally controversial. The academic critique was at times uncivil. What led to this perhaps crazy idea of a Greek culture arising out of nothing? And what could be so demoralizing to think that the Greeks may have been influenced by their Egyptian neighbors? It makes me think of the Schiller Classification that we just heard about. This is a long story, and the Atlantic slave trade is implicated, but suffice it to say that the historians, the archaeologists, the philologists, and literary critics were predominantly European men or men of European descent. I've even recently talked with those who would say, but those men were neutral. They didn't have an agenda. They were just interpreting the text or the artifact. But we know that this objectivity is really not a reality, and these scholars did have agendas, whether they were conscious of it or not, and their works line our shelves. These men, as is true for most of us, had a frame of reference. They had preconceived notions. Their work was influenced by their upbringing and education. This is why our shelves must be decolonized, why whiteness must be recognized and decentered. A diversity of voices means a diversity of frames of reference and an opportunity to get beyond long-held, long-blinding assumptions. It is as though we are being jolted awake. It is the epiphany. Within the field, terms and phrases are being questioned. The designations of classical studies and Western civilization, for instance, and all of their baggage are being reconsidered. There are many ancient cultures and many antecedents to our present culture. A diversity of voices brings new questions to the table. Can they be asked? And who makes that decision? In conclusion, our collections must represent the diversity of voices, and they should be visible and discoverable. It may be that we need to have flexibility in the vocabulary we use to describe collections. An initiative like the Diversity in the Stacks blog posts provide one way to draw attention to the increasingly diverse scholarly landscape. Subject specialists can heighten their awareness of new directions in their fields and their developing and evolving vocabularies, and stay abreast of emerging voices. Is it a dilution to conscientiously ensure that our collections represent this diversity of voices? Or is it a long overdue enrichment and a recognition of how limited scholarship is when it is represented through a single dominant perspective? Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and to Amanda and my co-presenters tonight.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, finally, we have Jessica Ugstead from the University of Arizona's Cracchiolo Law Library, who's going to share some information about collaborative efforts with her colleagues in a number of areas. So thank you, Jessica.
Share my screen. Okay. As mentioned, my name is Jessica Ugstead. My pronouns are she, her. And before I begin, I would like to thank Amanda, the Biddle Law Library, and the University of Pennsylvania Carey School of Law for hosting this panel. I would also like to thank my fellow panelists and attendees of this event, and my fellow colleagues at the Law Library, especially the members of the Anti-Racist and Social Justice Working Group, Jaime Venezuela, Travis Spence, and Teresa Miguel Stearns, colleagues who facilitated the acquisition of new books, Sean Esposito and Monique Marquez, and everyone else in the library that I have collaborated with on related projects over this challenging year. I would also like to acknowledge the tribal lands the library inhabits. The University of Arizona sits on the original homelands of the indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. Aligning with the university's core value of a diverse and inclusive community, it's an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that makes up the Wildcat community. At the institutional level, it's important to be proactive and broadening awareness throughout campus to ensure our students feel represented and valued. I will be discussing the guide in 4 parts, which is the guide that we created, and it kind of encompasses all of these other projects that we've been working on. Second, I will highlight the law library community's involvement with the guide. Third, I will provide a few examples of how the guide has evolved. And finally, I will briefly share a couple of related projects that are connected to the guide and future projects that I plan to develop. To begin, I will provide a brief background and overview of the Anti-Racist and Social Justice Resources Guide. In June 2020, following a series of tragic incidents of police killings and brutality against people of color, the Association of College and Research Libraries issued a statement in support of other groups speaking out against racial injustice. This statement included a call, quote, to take action against systemic and inequitable policing practices, end quote. This curated collection of resources and associated projects is one example of how our library heeded this call. Since its inception, this guide continues to grow topically and be updated as events occur and laws are passed. Currently, the guide is organized into 8 main sections, as you can see listed here on the sidebar. The first section is dedicated to Arizona law and is curated by Law Special Collections. This selection includes the Statements Against Racism from the College of Law Student Groups collection, which has been organized in a gallery, and selections of academic scholarship written by College of Law faculty. The second section is dedicated to racial justice and includes resources on topics such as anti-racism, implicit racial bias and institutional racism, re-examining history and civil rights, the Fed uprising and police brutality, criminal justice and police reform, the Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name movements, reparations, and the re-examination of Indigenous history and rights. The second section, which is opening up slowly. The second section is dedicated to women's rights and includes resources on topics such as re-examining history, reproductive rights and justice, Me Too and Time's Up, sex and hospitality workers' rights, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The fourth section is dedicated to LGBTQIA+2 and includes terminology and resources on topics such as re-examining history and rights and addressing violence and intolerance. The fifth section is dedicated to immigration rights and includes resources on topics such as re-examining history, DACA and Dreamers, family separation, detention and deportation, sanctuary cities and the border, and the Muslim ban. And the sixth section of the guide is titled Get Involved, which includes resources on how to and where to protest, donate time, money, and expertise, sign or create petitions, and join organizations and movements. Each section of the guide is topically organized using tabbed boxes, as you can see here. We make efforts to navigate users to related parts of the guide within each tab because of the intersectional nature of the topics. Tabs include links to primary and secondary resources, including legal and legislative, news articles, CSOs, and academic research and scholarship, teaching resources, including databases, toolkits, guides, curriculum, and book lists, embedded multimedia, including video clips, panel discussions, films, podcast episodes, images and music, and images and summaries from books from our BIPOC and tribal law collections. We created this guide with our law library community in mind and with the intention of not only providing access to valuable resources, but opportunities for students and faculty to get involved. That brings us to the last two sections of the guide, the events blog and the reading group. This guide has been a unique way to bring our library community together by offering a place to share local and national events through our curated events blog. The blog was created to promote upcoming virtual events on topics such as diversity, racism, and social justice to further the discussion taking place in our Arizona law community. Students, faculty, and staff are invited to submit events, and it's open to the public, so feel free to subscribe when you visit the guide, and I'll share the link later. The guide also serves as a hub for the faculty-led, student-driven reading group that has formed around topics including environmental justice, redlining and restrictive covenants, and education. This group is limited to the Arizona law community and initially started as a college-wide response to racial injustice and evolved into further supporting the Arizona Law's Black Law Students Association's year-long speaker series titled Racial Justice in the Law, Understanding the Path and Preparing for the Future. In addition to events, College of Law students and faculty are invited to contribute authors and topics to be considered for addition to the guide. Now I will share a few ways I have applied what I have learned about listening to and representing marginalized communities, topics, and groups while researching the topics for this guide and how this guide is in a state of perpetual evolution. The terminology used throughout the guide has focused on using the language of activists, authors, and speakers. For example, the term Fed Uprising appears to have been coined by Michael Harriot, a journalist at The Root, when he began writing about George Floyd's death at the hands of police and to challenge the negative connotation of the words protest and rioting. Another example of this is the use of definitions from authors, activists, and academics in their own words throughout the guide. And this is an example of that. Another example of the evolution of the guide that was fundamental in making the guide what it is today was after the first version was complete, we asked College of Law faculty to interact with it and provide their feedback. During that time, we also began to receive submissions of authors and topics from College of Law students and faculty to potentially add to the guide. After receiving feedback and submissions, especially one from a member of the Arizona student chapter of the Federalist Society, the Anti-Racist and Social Justice Working Group realized we needed to discuss what the purpose and parameters of the guide would be. We had to consider, one, that we're part of a public institution in a state that has a conservative legislature, two, that the law school faculty and students commonly teach and learn via the debate of topics, and three, that there's an expectation of libraries and librarians to provide non-biased delivery of services and resources. After careful consideration, we made three important decisions. First, we decided that the purpose of this guide was to highlight and increase access to anti-racist and social justice resources, and that it was not intended to be a traditional research guide providing resources for all sides of a debated topic. This would not be the place where debate on whether or not social issues actually exist, such as systemic racism, implicit bias, and police brutality. Rather than debate reality, the guide includes opinions and strategies on how best to address these and other social issues, as long as they are not bigoted. Second, though we were resistant to becoming gatekeepers to the guide, the working group researched conservative scholars and speakers to determine whether they met the scope of the guide. We then compiled a list of books to order for our collection whose authors were not included in the guide to support and represent opinions outside of the guide. We also decided to change the name of the guide from Racial and Social Justice Lib Guide to the Anti-Racist and Social Justice Resources Guide to help clarify the purpose of the guide for users and to emphasize our commitment to curating resources about, supporting, and promoting anti-racism. The final example I will share about the evolution of the guide concerns the Indigenous rights resources. Since creating the guide, I have been conflicted on whether to make an Indigenous rights standalone section or to keep the set of topics in the tab under the racial justice section where they currently reside. Recently, after listening to a Red Nation podcast episode pertaining to the underrepresentation of Native issues in the media, I decided to create a separate section. With an Indigenous rights section, I will be able to give each subtopic the respect and exposure that it deserves, while also supporting our tribal law collection and the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy, the IPLP program here at Arizona Law. Arizona Law has the largest contingency of Indigenous students and faculty in the country, and we are dedicated to providing them with the resources they need to effectuate change, while also supporting our commitment to better representation of tribal communities in our library resources. Now I will briefly discuss a couple of projects that are related to the guide and a few plans I have for future projects to continue to decolonize the stacks and increase exposure to underrepresented and marginalized groups. The first project is the development of the Black, Indigenous, and People of Color BIPOC monograph collection featuring books by, for, and about underrepresented, marginalized people, groups, and topics. This collaborative project between myself, our head of collection management, and our acquisitions department. It has grown by over 350 titles since its inception in May 2020. And once received, new monographs are added to the guide and are curated for display on social media and within the library. And this is how they show up in the guide. Each tab has its own books. To support this project, we have also selected bookshop.org, an alternative to Amazon that supports independent bookstores as a vendor for these resources. The second project I will highlight is the development of the Tribal Law Collection, a standalone collection located in a prominent area of the library. This unique project was a result of collaboration between our circulation department, head of collection development, the IPLP program, and other experts in our library community with knowledge in tribal and Indigenous law. It involved identifying and relocating resources from other sections of the library pertaining to tribal law and expanding the collection with new and relevant resources. As the law library continues to strive toward providing our community with new and enriching resources and experiences, I have begun to develop the following projects. As I mentioned previously, I will be creating a separate Indigenous rights section in the guide, building upon the resources I have already compiled. Next, I intend to grow the guide by developing a disability rights section. I have already begun gathering the resources and plan to build out this section over the next few months. And finally, I plan to update the Library of Congress subject headings for the resources in the tribal law collection, similar to what Amanda was describing in the intro. There have been a few academic libraries in both the United States and Canada collaborating with Indigenous communities on updating subject headings in order to accurately represent Indigenous communities and topics and remove offensive and outdated language. I plan to develop a project that will incorporate this research and subsequent changes in order to update the subject headings for the titles in our collection. This brings me to the end of our presentation. I really appreciate having the opportunity to share our work, and I will share links to different resources in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. We do have one question for you, I think at least one. And how does the process of purchasing from bookshop.org work? And what is the workflow for that?
Oh, it's actually fairly easy. I mean, we're a very small library, so we purchase books. You know, I ask for them. They go through our head of collections. He approves them, and then they go to our acquisitions person, and we just all are basically in the same small building. We got this particular vendor approved through the U of A financials. So all I have to do is, find a link. I send it to my acquisition person. I usually create a list on a weekly basis of all the different books that we're collecting for this collection. I send it off, it gets approved, and then Monique goes ahead and orders those for us. And right now, because we're working from home, all those books get delivered to me. So it's like Christmas every day.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Now, Renee, Donna, Rebecca, and Jessica, for sharing your work with us today. We do have some questions in the queue, but please submit others, and we will take a look at those. So great. You know, can the other panelists see the Q&A as well? Just want to check. Okay. I think we've had this one in the queue for a while, since the beginning, so I'm curious what if other folks want to chime in on this. Do you have any suggestions for helping librarians and users understand the classifications and associations that are happening behind the scenes with all electronic research resources? How can we put pressure on vendors to prioritize transparency over fast conclusions or even imposing their own values? Thank you, Jessica. I just saw Jessica dropped the links to the resources in the chat, so thank you for that. Yeah, I wish I had an easy answer for the vendors question. I will say that's probably a constant struggle for us, and I think it sort of nails the toughness in that question. Is like, how do we I think advocate for the users and sort of also educate the users, because I think the users of these resources often also want the quickest conclusions and answers, and aren't necessarily informed about sort of the biases that are happening behind the scenes and what they might be missing.
I think that Jessica articulated one of the ways that we can advocate, and that is to vote with your feet. So instead of using, resources that don't amplify the voices and the economic value of underrepresented people, move to a source that does, if that's available.
I agree. We had really considered this for a while on switching. We don't 100% use that particular vendor, but I do make a very conscious choice on a regular basis to do so. I also think it's important when we do projects like the one that we're hoping to do with the tribal law collection is, talk about it, we utilize social media a lot. So maybe when that project is complete, we'll, explain the situation to the students, especially focusing on the IPLP community, so that, they understand the changes that were made, why they were needed, and the benefits to the users. I just think the more we talk about it, the better it's going to get.
Yes, and I think as I prepared for my opening remarks, I think the thing that hit me the most is that we really have a big role here, not only as the people who acquire these materials for our users, but as the people who can educate the researchers and our users on, again, all of these things, the biases, the underlying issues with these resources. So
I also think that it's important to not be scared or intimidated to create collections, and you may, need to change your classification numbers or, manipulate things so that they work in what you're trying to do within your library and the resources that you're trying to bring attention to. We don't have to follow the rules, we don't have to do it just because that's the way it's always been done. The more we question, again, the more that these changes can take place.
Absolutely. Jessica, another question for you is, how are you sharing these new acquisitions with your community?
Oh, goodness. Aside from the guide, I do displays on we really only go through Facebook, which I think also feeds through Twitter. But I do displays, they're just flat displays. We are looking to get like some sort of widgets that it's more interactive and nice looking, but for now I just do these flat displays. I do them every 2 weeks. Right now, this past Monday, I just did 6, and they were all dedicated to Black History Month. I don't name them in any way except in my own head, so there's that. And then when we're normally in person, I haven't been into the library in quite a while. We'll do physical displays as well. So I keep we don't keep the book covers on our books, so I keep all those book covers and I make photocopies of all of the books that don't have book covers. so that I can create displays with those anytime I want to when we're actually physically there. And I'm considering starting maybe a secondary blog within the guide that could highlight those books when they come in, or any new additions to the guide to try to draw more attention, because there is so much information that I add on a regular basis.
Another question is, I don't have great insight on this, so I'm hoping some others may. Does the Library of Congress have any role with helping decolonize? Do they have any task forces working on this topic?
I feel like I should know the answer to that. I don't. I do know, like I said, that there's been research and people working to get those subject headings changed, and I could only assume that there's a larger group involved in that, but at the top of my head, I don't know, but I could find out if no one else here knows.
Well, it's not my area, but actually just yesterday, I was one of our head of cataloging and technical services, Beth Camden, shared a report with me about the trying to change illegal alien to undocumented immigrants. And I know that there are organizations within the American Library Association that are working on that, and that I didn't get the feeling from, and again, this is not my area, I'm not an expert by any means, but it was a difficult process. And I think in the end, there never was action on or at least according to this report, there was not action on the part of the Library of Congress. At one point they approved of it, then there was congressional objection, which seems surprising.
Yeah, that was, when I was preparing through it, I did read that was the only time that Congress has ever interfered with the Library of Congress's subject headings.
So I thought, who would have thought Congress would have time to think about Library of Congress subject headings? But libraries had sort of taken an independent route with regard to that. So
I do see a comment came in through the questions form that says Library of Congress is actively working to decolonize the call numbers. So specifically mentioning the illegal alien to undocumented immigrants. So yeah, I think, you know, it's a massive bureaucracy, right? And so that takes time. And I've been thinking a lot about what we can do institutionally ourselves. You know, we don't have to use those subject headings if we don't want to. So that's a choice we can make, and probably a choice we should think about. I know some libraries have done that.
I did notice also recently in our library catalog that there are local subject headings, and I don't know as a more of a public service librarian, I don't understand how that works, but I did notice, because I was looking up, like, you know how there's artists and then there's women artists and African American artists, but I did find white. I think I did find a white male subject heading, but it was in the local subject heading. So I don't think that it was official, but I did find a couple things. And we did have, I think, like male artists or something, but it was the earliest book was 2017. So I think it's, if we are starting to recognize that artists are not men and then there are other kinds of artists, I think it's fairly recent in the subject headings.
From what I understand, it's fairly resource and time intensive, but our local consortium, which consists of 5 universities, it's called the Triangle Research Libraries Network, works to, we have a shared catalog. And what we do is we mask some of the offensive terms that come from the Library of Congress, and we replace them with our own terms.
Going to put a link into the chat for everybody, and thanks to someone for reminding me that there is a great documentary called Change the Subject that does sort of follows the push to change the subject heading that was initiated by the Dartmouth students. So that link is in the chat now. Another question here. How do librarians who are dedicated to social justice work within the limitations? Oh, sorry. How librarians who are dedicated to social justice? How do they work within the limitations to community members who may be interested in the same materials? So specifically interested in hearing how to work around community members being unable to use library resources, for example.
I can talk just briefly about one small thing that we've done, because our libraries have been closed to the public because of the COVID pandemic. We have arranged with Westlaw, which everyone knows is has a quite expensive database, to get weekly a set of passwords that we can dole out to any public patrons that would normally be able to come into our library to use our Westlaw account.
That's really great.
I believe we're still open on a very limited, I think you have to have permission sort of way for students. But leading up to the beginning of the semester last year, we prepared for the inevitable, unfortunately, to by getting a self-checkout. So students are able to access the building with their cards, so they could self-check out books. They could also request books, and I believe they had a shelf where students could just come into the lobby area and pick up books. So we tried to facilitate that way. And then with kind of our course reserves, they got permission to do more scanning than they normally would do, and make resources available that way. But for the types of resources that I've been purchasing, yeah, people still have access. And I mean, they can come to our location. We still are doing like the interlibrary loans through the mail. And they can also, I think, do a similar thing at the main library if they're more on the main campus than on our side. So that's what we've done.
We've been trying to, I think, purchase more ebooks when we can. So, knowing that folks can't make it into campus as regularly has changed our purchasing patterns, at least temporarily.
And I think it's important for libraries, especially Ivy League libraries that maybe have a higher price tag than others, when we have things that are in the public domain or not copyrighted, to share them as much as possible in our digital collections.
I think when it's not a pandemic, our doors are open to the public during most of the hours of the library. But there isn't a way to share collections or electronic resources at Penn except through interlibrary loan. And we are still doing that, but I would have to, if somebody contacts me, we do like our chat service is open to anybody who contacts us. So I'm often telling people to, go to your local public library and you can request the materials through interlibrary loan there. But yeah, we don't, it's maybe difficult for people to connect with the collections.
Well, I do see that we've gone over time. So thank you everybody for attending. Again, thank you to the panelists. This has been amazing, and I really appreciate all of your willingness to participate and to share your work with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity to speak about our work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
So thank you to all of our panelists again. This was an amazing conversation, and we're so glad that you all decided to join us. On behalf of the Toll Public Interest Center, I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us for this Public Interest Week event. This is our last Public Interest Week event, so we really hope you enjoyed the suite of really great discussions that we've gotten to have. And we do invite you to join us tomorrow. Tomorrow is our 40th annual Spare Symposium. The symposium will be on reimagining freedom, abolition as a practice. We have 4 great panels lined up for tomorrow and a wonderful keynote. So we do invite you to visit our website and learn more about that. But with that, I will close out this wonderful event. Thank you again for everyone joining us. And thank you so much once more to our panelists. Have a wonderful evening.